An excavator hit something metal in the swamp, and within seconds everyone froze, pale and terrified. A rusted coffin rose from the mud, with a truth that refused to stay buried. Someone tried to erase it forever, but now it's back. Are you ready to discover the secret worth killing for? Hit like, subscribe, and tell us, what would you do if you found a coffin in a swamp? The morning haze still clung to the lowland like a stubborn ghost refusing to leave, and the heavy machinery rumbled to life with the reluctance of tired giants. The construction site stretched across a vast area outside the city limits, where a new highway was planned to slice through old farmland and a cluster of wetlands. People here had always called simply the swamp. It wasn't a picturesque marshland. The water was dark and thick like oil, choked by tangled roots and murky silt. For the workers, this was the worst section of the project. The ground swallowed machinery like a hungry pit, and every day brought delays, malfunctioning equipment, and curses thrown into the air along with clouds of gnats. Artem, a 39-year-old construction worker who had spent most of his life on job sites just like this one, stood near the edge of the swamp in his reflective vest and muddy boots, sipping lukewarm coffee from a metal thermos. He wiped sweat from his brow, though the sun had barely risen. It was that kind of place, humid, heavy, suffocating. He had been at this job for 3 months, putting in long hours for an average paycheck, trying to keep up with bills and obligations that never stopped multiplying. Yet despite everything, he found a kind of peace in the routine of labor. He liked the feeling of shaping something with his hands, bringing order to chaos. A road meant progress, connection, something that would outlast him. It meant a legacy of sorts. The swamp, however, had different plans. The excavator operator, Leonid, lowered the massive bucket deep into the wet ground, where it disappeared beneath a layer of black water that rippled outward with a sickening gurgle. The company had rushed them to finish this section. Deadlines loomed like vultures, and the supervisors were losing patience. They were supposed to dig down until they reached solid soil, a task easier said than done in a place that seemed determined to remain untouched. Artem glanced around. The site buzzed with workers in fluorescent orange and yellow, all focused on their assigned tasks. The foreman barked orders through a megaphone, anxious to speed things up. There was tension everywhere, a pressure that made people work faster than was wise. Artem didn't like that. He respected the swamp in a way. Places like this held secrets. Land that sits quiet for decades doesn't surrender easily. Leonid pulled the bucket back up, but it jerked to a sudden stop. The excavator shuddered violently, nearly flipping forward. The engine groaned. Leonid cursed loudly and adjusted the controls, trying again. The bucket refused to move. Something was holding it. "What the hell now?" the foreman muttered as he approached. Artem set his thermos on the ground and jogged toward the machine. The other workers noticed the commotion and paused, wiping dirt and oil from their hands as they looked on. The excavator whined again as Leonid forced the hydraulics, and suddenly something lurched upward from the mire. A dark shape began to surface, dripping sludge and weeds, clattering against the metal bucket as it rose into the gray morning light. At first, it looked like a large, rusted container, maybe a storage locker or a crushed oil tank. But as the muck slid away, revealing sharp angles and a box-like form, the mood shifted. The workers leaned in, squinting, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The shape was too clean in its geometry, too deliberate. The foreman's face went pale. "That's a coffin," someone whispered. Artem felt a cold jolt run through him. He stepped closer, ignoring the foreman's instinctive attempt to block him with an arm. He had never seen a coffin like this before. It wasn't wooden or decorative, but industrial thick steel plates welded together, its once smooth surface corroded and pitted after years beneath the swamp. Thick streaks of reddish-brown rust ran down its sides like dried blood. Water dripped from its corners in long strands of slime. The bucket rotated slightly, remaining suspended so all could see. On the upper part of the coffin, faint but unmistakable, were deep scratches, long horizontal gouges, not from the bucket or any tool. They were uneven, overlapping, wild, as if someone had clawed at the inside with desperate strength. Artem's stomach knotted. He said nothing, but the thought clawed its way into his mind nonetheless. Something or someone had tried very hard to escape. A wave of unease washed over the sight. Even the constant insect hum seemed to pause, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. The foreman ordered Leonid to lower the bucket gently onto the ground. A couple of younger workers backed away, muttering prayers under their breath. One joked nervously, trying to dispel the fear, but his voice cracked halfway through and the joke died unspoken. The foreman pulled out his phone and radio, contacting authorities. There was no protocol in the manual for this. A metal coffin buried intentionally in a swamp was not an accident. It raised questions nobody wanted the answers to. Artem stood beside the coffin, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He couldn't help but study every strange detail. The way the seams were welded shut in places, the odd pattern around the edges suggesting it may have once been padlocked, and small dents scattered across the top as if struck repeatedly by something heavy. Or someone. He had worked on many sites, dug up many discarded things, rusted pipes, car parts, animal bones, even unexploded ordnance once on an old military lot. But never this. Never anything that radiated silence so loudly. It felt like the coffin was a story sealed shut, now ripped open against its will. Police and then forensic specialists arrived unusually fast, as if they were already expecting trouble from this area. They cordoned off the swamp and kept the workers back. Cameras flashed, blue gloves tapped and inspected, voices low and tense. Two officers carefully guided the metal coffin into a separate truck using a crane. It was heavier than it had any right to be. Artem found himself stepping closer, right up to the moment they hoisted the coffin. The crane lifted it just enough for him to see underneath. That was when something small slipped through a gap, a glint of silver falling and landing in the mud with a barely audible thud. He froze. No one else noticed. Everyone's eyes were on the coffin, not the ground. Artem crouched down swiftly, pretending to tie his bootlace. His fingers brushed past clumps of cold mud until they touched metal. He wrapped his hand around it and lifted it discreetly. It was a key, a heavy, old-fashioned key attached to a thin chain, the kind used for a safe or a locker, not for houses, not for cars. The weight of it in his hand felt disproportionate to its size, as if holding it meant holding a burden. He slipped it into his pocket as quietly as possible. His heartbeat quickened again. He didn't know why he did it. Curiosity? Instinct? Or maybe because something deep inside told him that whatever truth lay in that coffin wasn't going to willingly come to light. When the police truck drove away with the coffin sealed inside, the swamp inhaled again, and the world resumed its buzzing. Workers, restless and jittery, returned to their machines and tools. But the shift was called off early. Nobody could concentrate. They all had families to call, stories to share, nightmares forming in their minds. Artem washed his hands mechanically at the portable sink, though he couldn't wash off the chill crawling under his skin. He retrieved his thermos, packed his tools, and headed toward the pickup that would take him home. But his hand never left his pocket, curling possessively around the cold metal key. The foreman walked by, pale and tense, pretending everything was under control. "We'll be back tomorrow," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let the police do their job. This doesn't change anything." But they both knew that was a lie. Something had shifted beneath the surface of the swamp, of the project, of their lives. On the drive home, Artem barely spoke. He stared out the window, the swamp stretching behind him like a dark memory. His fingers played with the key unconsciously. He tried to convince himself he should turn it in, tell the authorities he found it. But the thought made his chest tighten with dread. Something told him that if the police had found it, they might have pretended they didn't. Something told him that this key was not meant to be discovered, not by them. He arrived home and went through the motions. Shoes off, dinner reheated, shower to wash off sweat and mud. But the key never left his nearby reach. He placed it on the small kitchen table and stared at it while a cheap TV show played, ignored in the background. What did this key open? Why had the man in the coffin held onto it until his last breath? And what kind of death ends with being welded shut into a steel box and buried where no one would ever find you? As night deepened and silence filled the house, Artem realized that picking up that key had been more than a moment of curiosity. It had been a decision, one he hadn't thought through, but one that would soon demand answers. He felt watched, even alone in his home. A strange chill lingered in the corners of the room. He turned out the lights and lay in bed, but sleep refused to come. His thoughts were dragged back to the coffin, the scratches, that heavy thump as it hit the ground, the way the swamp had resisted letting it go. Someone wanted this man erased, and someone had nearly succeeded. Artem stared at the ceiling, hearing the distant hum of traffic, waiting for dawn and dreading it at the same time. The swamp had given up a secret, and he had taken a piece of it. That key wasn't just a clue, it was a promise that the story of the man in the coffin was far from over. The next morning, the air at the construction site felt different, as if the swamp had exhaled something heavy into the atmosphere, and it had settled over the men like an invisible fog. The same machines were there, lined up along the torn earth, and the same orange vests moved between them, but the usual rough laughter and habitual curses sounded thinner, pushed through a layer of unease that had not been there before. The ground where the coffin had come up looked like a wound, a deep scar of blackened mud leading to the place where the excavator bucket had broken the surface and exposed what was never meant to be seen again. Artem stood by the portable office, waiting for instructions, but most of the conversations around him were not about plans and deadlines. They were about the coffin. Someone claimed he had seen a ringed hand through a crack in the lid. Another swore the scratches were really letters in some coded language, and another insisted that the swamp had always been cursed because years ago something terrible happened there. Nobody had details, only rumors passed along like a virus, reshaped and dramatized with each retelling. Yet beneath all the exaggeration lay the same simple truth. A man had been hidden in a steel coffin and dumped in mud like trash, and they had been the ones to bring him back into the light. The foreman tried to impose order, speaking louder than usual, his tone clipped and impatient. He told them to focus on work, to stay away from the spot until the experts cleared it, to remember that they were here to build a road, not to play detectives. But his own eyes kept drifting toward the swamp, betraying a tension he could not conceal. He had spent his life solving problems with concrete and steel, not with dead men and questions that trailed into unknown corridors. Work resumed in a limited way along the drier edges of the section, but the center near the water remained taped off, the soil still churned and dark. Police markers had been placed where the truck had been parked and where the coffin had rested. Now they stood like mute teeth, chewing into the workers' concentration. The excavator that had hauled up the coffin sat idle, its bucket washed but still seeming stained, as if the gesture could not erase what it had done. Artem took his place near another machine, but his mind would not stay with the task. The previous night had left him hollow. He had hardly slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coffin breaking through the surface, dripping slime. The scratches clawed into the metal, and then the small glint of the key as it slipped into the mud. He had replayed that moment again and again, feeling the cold weight of the key in his palm, the instinctive decision to hide it, the certainty that this single action bound him to a story he did not yet understand. The key now lay hidden in a folded pair of work pants in his locker in the makeshift changing area. Even knowing it was there seemed to alter his perception of the day. He watched the police tape, the swamp, the idle crane, and he knew that while for most of his colleagues this was a strange incident that would soon turn into a story to share over drinks, for him it was a beginning. It felt as if the man in the coffin had reached out from death, offering him a thread and silently daring him to pull on it. By midday, the sight settled into a strained rhythm. The constant backdrop of engines and impact hammers tried to reclaim dominance over the workers' thoughts, but whispers still threaded through the noise. Someone had heard that the police believed the coffin might have been in the swamp for a decade or more. Someone else said the forensic team thought the man inside had not died peacefully. None of it surprised Artem. He only wanted to know who the man had been and why someone had gone to such lengths to erase him. The answer to that question began to take form that evening, not at the site, but in a place Artem never liked visiting, the city morgue. He did not go there himself, not at first. Instead, he called someone who worked there, an old acquaintance named Sergei. Years ago, when Artem's father had died unexpectedly, Sergei had been the one to arrange the formalities at the morgue, and they had kept in loose contact since. Sergei was the sort of man who always knew a little more than he was supposed to, largely because he listened when others assumed the dead could not speak. Artem called him after his shift, sitting on a cracked bench at the back of the construction yard, the sky turning a dusty purple overhead. He did not mention the key. He only said that he worked on the road where they had found the coffin, and that he wanted to know, unofficially, what the examiners had discovered. At first, Sergei hesitated. It was sensitive, he said. It might turn into a big case. But curiosity and old favors have their own weight, and eventually the resistance gave way. He agreed to tell Artem what he knew. Later that night, as Artem sat alone in his kitchen, Sergei's voice came through the phone, low and careful, as if the walls themselves might be listening. The man inside the coffin, he said, was thought to be in his late 40s or early 50s at the time of death. His clothes, though ruined by years in water, had been of good quality, a suit, shirt, tie, and shoes that suggested he had not been homeless or destitute. The body bore clear signs of violence. Several ribs had been fractured in a pattern consistent with repeated blows. One arm showed an old break that had healed poorly, and the skull had a hairline fracture at the back. The pathologists believed he had been beaten, perhaps restrained, before being placed in the coffin. There were no identifying documents left on him. But there had been something else, a clue not of flesh and bone, but of intention. Sergei told Artem that in one of the inner pockets of the ruined jacket, the examiners had found a small, old-fashioned dictaphone, the kind that recorded on miniature tapes. Miraculously, the metal casing had helped protect it. Water had seeped inside, but not enough to destroy everything. The forensic technicians had managed to dry it out and extract a distorted but partly salvageable recording. Sergei could not send Artem the recording, but he described what he had heard. The voice on the tape was hoarse, strained, the words spoken with the labored breaths of someone in pain. It belonged to a man who knew he was in danger and who believed he might not survive long enough to speak to anyone in person. He spoke of being taken somewhere against his will, of being threatened, of hearing others discussing how to make him disappear. He mentioned a swamp, or at least a place far from the city, where no one went and where nobody would ask questions if a man simply stopped existing. There were names here and there, but many were muffled or interrupted. The clearest parts were not the identifying details, but the intention behind the message. The man, whoever he was trying to leave behind some kind of testimony. What chilled Artem most, however, was the part where, according to Sergei, the dead man spoke of a woman. his wife. She had been a journalist, he said, someone too stubborn to be bought or silenced easily. She had been investigating a network of corruption involving public contracts, land deals, and disappearances disguised as accidents or sudden relocations. He believed that both of them had stumbled onto something too big to be tolerated. He expected that they would go after her next if they had not already. The tape cut out abruptly when the man began to mention a specific surname, one that might have tied the whole story to someone recognizable. There was a noise, a sharp crack, and then nothing but static. Whether that sound had been a blow to his head, the recording device being struck from his hand, or some other violent interruption, the technicians could not say. There was no continuation. The dead man's final attempt to speak had ended mid-sentence, severed like the life that produced it. As Sergei spoke, Artem's gaze drifted to the key, which he had taken from its hiding place and placed on the table in front of him. Under the weak overhead light, the metal looked dull and worn, the small chain slightly kinked where it had once looped around something, perhaps a wrist, perhaps a belt. He did not need to hear the tape himself to understand that the key had been important. The man in the coffin had clung to two things: a recording device and that key. One to tell his story, the other to guard the proof of it. Sergei went on to say that, after some checking, the forensic team and detectives had tentatively matched the physical description and rough age of the corpse to an old missing person case from 15 years earlier. A man who had worked as an engineer and financial consultant on major infrastructure projects had vanished without a trace. His name, according to the old files, had been linked to several contracts involving public funds, large construction companies, and land around the very region where the swamp and the new highway now intersected. At the time, his disappearance had been officially recorded as unresolved. There had been some quiet murmurs in the news about potential foul play, but nothing stuck. The file had faded into the background, another unresolved line in an archive no one visited. The real thread that tied the corpse to history, however, was not his own record, but that of his wife. She had, as the tape implied, been a journalist. Years ago, she had written a series of articles questioning the allocation of government money to certain construction projects, hinting at ghost companies, inflated costs, and environmental abuses covered up by doctored reports. Her work had angered the wrong people. After her husband disappeared, she had continued pressing, according to what Sergei had learned. She had tried to push her investigations further, and then she, too, had vanished. Officially, there had been talk of emigration or a breakdown. Unofficially, those who knew her had suspected something darker, but had lacked the evidence or courage to pursue it. Listening to all of this, Artem felt as though someone had slowly started turning up the contrast on his world. What had been a disturbing curiosity, a coffin in a swamp, now sharpened into a recognizable pattern. A man who had known too much about money that flowed in muddy channels. A woman who had tried to shine a light on that mud. Both erased. Then, years later, purely by chance, the ground that had swallowed one of them decided to give him back. Sergei mentioned the dictaphone as a key piece of evidence. The police were taking it seriously, he said. They were analyzing every fragment of sound, every distorted word. There was talk that, if the voice was authenticated and enough details could be drawn from it, the recording might reopen old investigations. Names already half hidden under other scandals might rise to the surface again. Artem thanked him when the conversation ended and hung up, though the word felt inadequate to the magnitude of what he had just learned. He sat for a long time in silence, the phone lying face down beside him, his eyes fixed on the key. If the dictaphone was the man's voice, then the key was the man's hand, still reaching. It seemed obvious to Artem now that it had been meant to lead someone somewhere specific: a safe, a cabinet, a room where documents were kept, something that contained the very proofs that had made this man dangerous to kill, proofs that had justified, in some twisted logic, sealing him in a metal box and dropping him into a swamp. He imagined the final moments. The man forced into the coffin, beaten, perhaps bound. In that darkness, with only brief cracks of light and the sound of voices outside, he had clutched the only two objects he still controlled. He had pressed the record button and held onto the key. When they welded the lid shut and lowered him down, he had likely still been alive, still hoping that someone, someday, might find him and continue what he could not finish. That hope had been absurd on the surface. Who would dig into a swamp by accident? But now, all these years later, Artem had been there with the excavator. The absurd hope had been rewarded in the most unlikely way. The knowledge did not fill Artem with triumph. It made him feel small and exposed. He was no investigator, no journalist, no hero. He was a construction worker with muddy boots and a simple life. Yet the key had fallen in front of him, and he had picked it up. He could no longer pretend he was just a bystander standing at a rope line watching the professionals handle it. He turned the key over between his fingers, tracing the grooves with his thumb. It was larger than a regular house key, flat and thick with a squared-off head. The teeth were cut in a distinctive pattern, not the kind used for interior doors. He thought of industrial sites he had worked in before, of storage rooms and secure cabinets. He remembered once seeing a similar key used for a wall-mounted safe in an office at a different construction firm. It made sense. A man in his line of work dealing with financial records might have kept sensitive materials locked away in case he ever needed to defend himself or expose something. That thought led naturally to another. If such a safe or cabinet still existed, it might still contain those materials. They might be the missing half of the story that the dictaphone began telling. If the police found them, they could build cases, protect witnesses, bring charges. Or they could hide them, misplace them, lock them in a drawer. Not everyone in a uniform was clean. That was a lesson the dead man had learned late and at great cost. Artem tried to imagine going to the authorities with the key. He pictured a detective frowning, taking it, asking why he had not handed it over earlier. There would be questions, suspicion, perhaps accusations of tampering or theft. The key would disappear into a locker, and he would be sent home to wait for a call that might never come. Meanwhile, those who had put the man in the coffin could be warned that some unknown worker held a piece of the puzzle they thought lost. A worker whose name was in a report, whose address was not hard to find. The other option, equally frightening, was to keep the key and do nothing. To slide it back into his pocket tomorrow, continue his shift, and pretend he had never seen it. He could tell himself that the professionals were already handling it, that the recording was in the hands of people who knew how to use it, that his involvement was unnecessary. But there was the memory of the man's recorded voice, relayed through Sergei's words. A man left to die because he had tried to reveal something. There was the image of scratch marks inside the coffin lid. There was the understanding that someone had gone to great lengths to make sure those proofs would never see the light of day. Above all, there was the sense that, by picking up the key, Artem had unknowingly accepted a responsibility. Objects passed between hands for reasons not always visible. The dead did not get to choose their heirs, but stories did in a way. They clung to whoever was willing to carry them forward. He sat at the table for a long time, the room around him dim, the refrigerator humming quietly in the background. His dinner lay half-eaten in front of him, forgotten. Outside, the city had settled into its evening sounds, cars passing at regular intervals, dogs barking in distant yards. Here, in this small space, the air felt heavy and charged, as if it held a decision waiting to be made. Finally, Artem exhaled slowly and made it. He would not go to the police with the key. Not yet. He needed to know first what it opened. He needed to see with his own eyes whether there were documents, records, anything that could complete the confession the man had tried to record. Only then, When he had some understanding of the scale and the danger, would he decide whom to trust with it? Maybe it would still be the authorities. Maybe it would be someone else. But blind faith had already cost one man his life and another woman her disappearance. Artem refused to offer himself as the next blind sacrifice. He gathered up the key, wiped it clean with a napkin as if that would erase the swamp residue and fingerprints, and slipped it into a sturdier hiding place than his work pants. He chose a small metal box at the back of his wardrobe, one that had once held his father's war medals and old photographs. Those mementos still lay there, the last tangible pieces of a life spent working hard and expecting little. Artem placed the key beside them and closed the lid gently, feeling as if he had laid one kind of inheritance next to another. When he went to bed, the ceiling above him seemed lower, the darkness thicker. Sleep came in fragments, chased away by images of water closing over metal, of fists pounding on steel, of a hand curled around a key, refusing to let go. In brief snatches of rest, he found himself walking through empty offices and dusty storage rooms, turning keys in locks that would not open, while unseen footsteps followed just out of sight. By the time dawn began to seep through the thin curtains, Artem no longer felt like the same man who had stood at the swamp's edge the previous morning. The world had not changed on the surface. The highway still needed to be built. The foreman would still be impatient. The machines would still roar. But somewhere beneath all that, another layer had been revealed. A hidden structure built not of rebar and concrete, but of secrets, fear, and money. A structure that had claimed lives and then tried to bury them beyond reach. He knew now that he had stepped onto a path that could not simply be walked backwards. The key in its metal box had turned from an object into a question, and it would not tolerate being ignored for long. Soon he would have to start looking for the lock that matched it. Somewhere in the city, perhaps in a building long neglected or an office once used by the man in the coffin, there would be a place where that key slid in and turned with a grim, inevitable click. Artem closed his eyes for a moment more, not in search of sleep, but to gather resolve. He told himself that he would be careful, that he would move slowly, that he would avoid drawing attention. Yet he also knew that, in matters like this, careful steps were sometimes as dangerous as reckless ones. Still, he had made his choice. The swamp had given him a voice from the past. The key was the next word in that unfinished sentence. And whether he felt ready or not, Artem understood that he was now responsible for finding out how that sentence ended. The next day, Artem woke with the feeling that someone had slipped into his dreams and rearranged the furniture of his mind while he slept. His world, which had once followed simple, predictable line-shift hours, grocery lists, weekends spent fixing the balcony, had twisted into something more uncertain, darker along the edges. He moved through his morning routine in a fog, though his hands still knew exactly what to do. Boil the kettle, wash his face, lace his boots. The key's absence from sight did nothing to remove its weight from his thoughts. It seemed to cast a shadow even from behind a closed drawer, as if reminding him that he had taken a step he could not undo. At the construction site, he tried to blend into the familiar rhythm of shovels and steel. But he noticed immediately that not everything had returned to normal. A pair of new faces in dark jackets stood near the swamp, talking to the foreman. They weren't police. Artem had seen enough law enforcement by now to recognize the uniforms and demeanor. These men carried themselves with a different kind of authority, a quieter, more dangerous self-assurance. They were keeping their voices low, but their eyes were scanning the workers, one by one, as if trying to read guilt from their expressions. When their gaze passed over Artem, a prickling sensation crawled across the back of his neck. He bent down as if inspecting a cable, avoiding eye contact. If they were here because of what the forensic tape had revealed, they were not only interested in the dead man, they were interested in anyone who might have touched the truth he left behind. The foreman called everyone together, forcing a strained attempt at professionalism. He explained that crews from higher authorities were handling the incident and that work would continue under close supervision. The swamp area would stay off limits until further notice. They needed to be patient, cooperative, and silent about what they had found. The company valued order and discretion. No rumors, no talking to the press, no speculation. "This will all be resolved soon," he said, though sweat glistened on his forehead despite the morning chill. Artem listened, but his focus was elsewhere. The evening conversation with Sergei continued echoing through his thoughts, pulling him back to the key every few minutes. It was clear that whatever had happened 15 years ago had not lost its power to stir fear in those involved. If a man had died for what he tried to expose, then those who had killed him were likely still watching the shadows for anything that might crawl back out. During a break, Artem slipped away to his pickup truck, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out an old map of the industrial zones surrounding the city. Most of the places he had worked on in the past were marked with grease pencil, the remains of old jobs, half-finished roads, warehouses, utilities. As he traced possible sites where the dead man might have once worked, he noticed a district near the railway, a cluster of abandoned buildings listed as storage facilities on outdated documents. The name of the company printed beside the area jogged something in his memory. He had seen the same company logo stamped on machinery during his first week at the swamp site. That was where he would start. He waited for his shift to end, pretending to be as exhausted as everyone else. But once he was alone on the road, he felt more alert than he had in weeks. The city blurred past his window in gray motion factories, billboards, and concrete blocks, standing like silent watchers. As the streets thinned, the surroundings transformed into wide stretches of empty lots, with tall grass reclaiming patches of cracked asphalt. He parked 2 blocks away and continued on foot, careful to avoid being noticed. The building he sought stood behind a barbed wire fence that sagged in several places. Its windows were shattered, its metal siding rusted in long tiers, and patches of graffiti added splashes of color to its neglect. Weeds grew tall and thick around the entrance, swaying gently as if whispering warnings to those who approached. Artem hesitated only briefly. He had been in places like this before, construction sites waiting for demolition or land disputes to resolve. The silence inside such structures always felt charged, like a breath held too long. The front door yielded easily when he pressed on it, the lock long since broken. Dust floated in the afternoon light, slanting through broken window panes. He moved slowly through the main hall, boots crunching on debris-shattered glass, scraps of wood, faded papers that once meant something to someone. His heartbeat seemed too loud in the stillness. He found the office corridor without difficulty, thanks to the faded directional signs on the walls. Some doors were missing entirely, others hung crooked from a single hinge. It was the kind of place people had stripped on their way out, taking whatever they thought still held value. But further inside, the building seemed less disturbed, as if scavengers had not bothered to rummage into areas that felt too official or too empty. When Artem reached a door labeled Management, he paused, touched the handle, and found it locked. It was the only intact lock so far. That alone made it suspicious. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the key. It took a moment before he could bring himself to try it. He stood there, key poised, staring at the metal plate of the lock, imagining everything that might wait on the other side. A part of him still hoped that the key would not fit, that this was the wrong building, the wrong office, that he had misread the signs. Because if he was right, then the story from the swamp would no longer be just a story. It would be real and breathing, reaching out to involve him more deeply than he was prepared for. But when he inserted the key, the mechanism responded immediately, with a firm, smooth turn. The lock clicked open. Artem closed his eyes briefly, letting out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He pushed the door inward. The office was small and windowless. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces coated in dust. A desk dominated the center of the room, still scattered with folders, yellowed memos, and a cracked coffee mug. Cobwebs stretched between the drawers like caution tape. Artem's flashlight beam skimmed over the cabinets until he reached the tallest one, bolted into the corner. Its drawers were shut, the top one locked. Without giving himself time to reconsider, he tried the same key. It turned just as easily, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside were stacks of documents, neatly bundled with string, each bundle labeled with years that overlapped the same period the dead man had been alive and fighting. Artem pulled out the first stack and set it on the desk. Receipts for large cash transfers disguised as equipment expenses. Invoices for materials that had never been delivered. Blueprints that showed discrepancies between the official plans and the built structures, names of shell companies that existed only on paper, signatures of people who he now realized held significant positions in the city, and among those papers, photographs. He picked one up. A man stood beside a newly constructed overpass, smiling confidently at the camera. It was the man from the swamp, younger then, his eyes bright with the pride of someone who believed his work had meaning. Beside him stood a woman with a press badge clipped to her coat, the journalist, his wife. Her gaze was fierce and focused even in the frozen image, as if she were searching for the truth in everything she saw. Behind them, half hidden by the angle of the photo, was a third figure. A small boy holding the hand of his father, his face turned toward the woman with admiration. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten note. He must live. Artem stared at those words. They were simple, but they throbbed with desperation and determination. Whoever had written them, perhaps the man himself, had known that someone would try to erase this child along with his parents. He searched deeper inside the cabinet and found what looked like surveillance stills, grainy black and white images showing the woman being followed. A car tailing her through narrow streets, anonymous figures standing across from her apartment. A timestamp indicated these photos had been taken shortly before her disappearance. Further back were official records that tied large payments to influential businessmen and a high-ranking city official. Artem recognized one of the names immediately. The same supervisor now trying to push the new highway to completion at any cost. A cold chill prickled up his spine. The corruption was not just an old story, it was the same project he was working on, the same swamp, the same road. Artem was still processing this realization when the creak of a floorboard outside made him freeze. He turned off the flashlight and held his breath. Silence returned, except for the faint rustle of paper settling under his hand. He waited, but there was nothing else. He forced himself to keep searching, racing against a threat he could not yet see. Behind the stacks of documents, he discovered a small metal box. It was sealed with a different kind of lock, not a keyhole but a combination dial. He lifted it. It was heavy. Whatever lay inside was more important than everything else combined. He tucked the box under his arm. He could return for the rest later, but this, the most sensitive evidence, could not stay here another night. Before leaving, he replaced the cabinets and drawers exactly as he had found them. He would come back again if he could, but for now, secrecy was his only shield. The lock clicked shut behind him as he exited the office, turning the key back to its neutral position. The hallway now looked different, darker, more dangerous. Every shadow seemed to shift, and every creak sounded like approaching footsteps. He made it outside and forced himself to walk calmly. Though his pulse hammered at triple speed, he did not notice, or tried not to notice, the faint imprint of fresh tire tracks near the building ones that had not been there when he arrived. By the time he reached his truck, his hands were shaking. He placed the metal box on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, breathing through the rush of panic rising in his chest. He had crossed a line now. He had taken evidence that others would be desperate to retrieve, evidence that could awaken old predators. The sun had almost set, clouds roiling in a bruised sky. Artem put the truck into gear and pulled away from the curb, glancing into the rearview mirror just once. A dark sedan parked behind a shipping container seemed to shift slightly, a pair of headlights glinting like eyes tracking him. He did not slow down. Driving through the empty streets back toward the city, Artem gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. The metal box rattled slightly every time he hit a bump. It was as if the dead man's voice insisted on being heard again and again. They will come after her next, if they have not already. Now Artem understood what the wife had faced. Now he realized what the man had tried to preserve in his final moments. And now, unwittingly, he had become the next living link in a chain others had killed to break. He arrived home late, the city lights flickering on as if signaling a curfew. Inside his apartment, he locked the door with more care than ever before and set the metal box on the kitchen table. He stared at it, knowing that whatever combination unlocked that final compartment of truth would also unlock something else. Consequences he could not yet measure. He took a step back and leaned against the wall. His breath came unsteadily, adrenaline still coursing through him. He wanted to calm down, to think rationally, to decide his next move. But fear kept knocking, louder each minute. Artem turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening. Beyond his walls, life went on as usual. Cars passing on the road, distant voices, laughter from a terrace. None of them knew that a ghost from 15 years ago was walking again, carrying proof of a conspiracy that had never been meant to surface. He could not shake the feeling that eyes were already searching for him, already narrowing in suspicion, already aware that something important was missing from its hiding place. The dead had placed their trust in him. Now the living would hunt him for it. Artem barely slept. The night bled into a cold, gray dawn that carried no comfort with it. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of wind against the window made him jolt upright, expecting to see unfamiliar figures outlined in the darkness. When the first light finally seeped into the apartment, it only exposed how little the world outside cared for his fears. Cars already rumbled on the street below, and a neighbor slammed a door while rushing off to work, entirely unaware that someone in the same building was now carrying burdens that once cost 2 lives. He didn't touch the metal box again that morning. He didn't dare. Instead, he hid it inside the deepest kitchen cabinet behind old jars and dusty cookware he never used. Then he left for work, trying to quiet his pulse with slow breaths. Pretending to be normal felt almost impossible, but he forced his steps to follow familiar rhythms. He needed to blend in. Until he understood more, until he knew where the danger was coming from, he could not afford to attract attention. The job site was unusually active when he arrived, but not because construction had resumed fully. Additional vehicles were parked near the swamp-sleek black SUVs that did not belong to any public agency. Men in corporate-branded jackets paced beside them, walking with the purposeful, aggressive strides of people hiding intimidation behind professionalism. They did not bother introducing themselves. Their presence alone was enough to send a warning. We are watching everything. The familiar police tape was gone. The swamp area had been completely walled off with temporary fencing, and crews were clearing brush and debris as if preparing for new operations there. The foreman's face was red with stress. He shouted instructions with exaggerated authority, but fear fluttered in his gestures. He understood something had shifted, control had slipped out of his hands. One of the suited men pointed at Artem while speaking quietly into a phone. Artem kept his head down, forcing his breathing into steady rhythm. He joined the small group assigned to drainage work along a gravel strip far from the swamp. Pickaxe, shovel, gravel simple tasks. He tried to let muscle memory override fear, but his mind would not cooperate. He kept seeing the photograph he had found in the office. The smiling woman, the determined man, the child caught between them, the handwriting on the back, He must live felt like a command that stretched across time, reaching through the swamp's filth and into Artem's chest. Whatever that man had tried to protect, whoever that boy was, the story wasn't finished. Late in the morning, misfortune struck, or rather, was made to strike. The excavator that had uncovered the coffin suddenly malfunctioned, jerking violently as though resisting its operator's control. The arm swung unexpectedly, smashing through a storage container and sending metal shrieking. Workers dropped everything and scrambled away. The foreman cursed, waving his arms frantically. Whether it was sabotage or an intimidating reminder that accidents could happen again, the message landed. Danger was not a thing of the past. During lunch, the atmosphere was suffocating. Workers huddled together, whispering like prey animals sensing predators nearby. A few reached Artem's table, nervous laughter masking concern. "You hear? Someone burned down the foreman's shed last night," one said, eyes darting. "Company's losing patience. We step out of line, we're done," another muttered. Artem only nodded. None of them knew how close that heat had gotten to him already. His phone buzzed then, an unknown number. He nearly ignored it, but something told him to answer. A male voice spoke quietly. "Leave it alone. Go home when your shift ends. Don't come back." Before Artem could respond, the call dropped. Then a second call came, this time from the site office summoning him inside immediately. The makeshift office felt smaller than ever. Two men in dark jackets sat across from the foreman, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. One of the strangers gestured for Artem to sit. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We appreciate your cooperation during the recent discovery," the man began. "But some materials seem to be missing from the scene. We're sure it was just confusion. Things get moved, misplaced." He let the sentence trail off meaningfully. "We simply want to ensure everything is returned." Artem forced his face to remain dull, confused. Just a tired worker who had no idea what they meant. "I didn't take anything. I only did what we were told." Silence stretched. The second man leaned forward slightly. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of this," he said. "The company is invested in finishing this road. People who slow it down tend to regret it." The foreman flinched. Artem swallowed hard. "I haven't slowed anything down." They studied him, heads tilted like predators sniffing doubt. Then, almost as quickly as it started, the interrogation ended. "Good." The first man stood up, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "We're glad we understand each other." But Artem knew they understood nothing. Not yet. And because they didn't understand, they would keep searching. He spent the rest of his shift haunted by the feeling of being watched. When the final whistle blew, he didn't linger. He left the site immediately, walking with deliberate calm until he reached a busier street. Only then did he exhale, letting his legs carry him wherever they wanted. He found himself near the city registry office, a place he had passed 1,000 times without a second thought. But now, memories from the documents he had found pushed their way forward. Among the files was one hinting at forced adoption children, quietly reassigned new names and identities when their parents became inconvenient. The boy in the photograph. Somewhere in this city, he was alive. Finding him became the only goal that made sense. Artem entered the registry building, nervous but determined. He approached the counter, choosing his words carefully, just a citizen looking for old family records. The clerk, bored but not suspicious, pointed him toward a back desk where archived adoption documents could be requested. Names were required. Artem didn't have them. But he did have dates approximate, but close enough. He flipped through computer screens under the clerk's supervision until one entry grabbed his attention. A child matching the rough age from the photograph. Adopted the year after the engineer disappeared. New surname obscure but traceable. Current address listed in a residential district not far away. The clerk printed the file before Artem's racing heart could betray his racing thoughts. He stared at the paper in his hands, an address that could change everything. He went straight there. The building he arrived at was ordinary, slightly run down, with rust stains beneath the windows and bicycles chained to railings. Children shouted from a nearby playground. Life went on here without any hint of buried secrets. Apartment 24. He knocked. No answer. He was turning to leave when footsteps echoed behind him. A young man in his early 20s walked up the stairs, headphones around his neck and a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked at Artem with cautious confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked. Artem's throat tightened. The face was older now, the roundness of childhood replaced with lean angles. But the eyes, those eyes were exactly the same as the child in the photograph. Artem managed to speak. "I'm looking for someone who might be related to you. Your parents, did they ever talk about where you came from?" The young man frowned, defensive walls rising instantly. "What is this? Who are you?" "My name is Artem, and I think I found something connected to your biological parents." Shock flickered through the young man's expression. He stared at Artem as if trying to decide whether he was insane. "My parents are dead," he said quietly. "My adoptive parents, I mean. Car accident when I was 15. After that, no one wanted to tell me anything. It was always not your concern, or better left alone. I hate those phrases." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The apartment was small but tidy, bookcases stuffed full, a worn couch, photographs of friends on the walls. It looked like the home of someone trying to build a life from scratch with the scraps he had been given. The young man introduced himself as Daniil. He listened as Artem told him, carefully, cautiously, about the coffin, the swamp, the documents, and the photograph. Daniil's face shifted from disbelief to horror, to something deeper and more painful, recognition of a void he had always sensed, but could never define. "So they didn't abandon me," Daniil whispered. "Someone took them away. Someone tried to erase them." Artem nodded. "And they might try again, if they realize you're still connected to their story." Daniil closed his eyes, shoulders trembling. Then he inhaled sharply, a spark of steel igniting behind the hurt. "Then we give them a reason to regret trying." Artem stared at him, this boy whose life had been broken before it started, yet who now stood unshaken by the truth. He reminded Artem of his father's quiet resilience, stubborn hope. The decision came naturally. They would work together. They would uncover everything. But as they sat together, making plans in hushed tones, neither of them noticed the car parked across the street. Inside, behind tinted windows, a man lifted a phone to his ear, watching Daniil's window with predator focus. "Yes," he murmured, "we've found him." For Artem and Daniil, their alliance had just begun. For those who had buried the truth, the hunt had just resumed. The next days unfolded like a tightening noose. Artem and Daniil no longer moved through the world as isolated individuals, but as a pair bound by danger and purpose. Every step they took, every whispered exchange, every glance over their shoulders reminded them that their lives had changed irreversibly. The question was no longer whether they were being watched. It was how closely. They avoided returning to the abandoned industrial building. Going back now would be reckless. The missing metal box was surely noticed. Instead, Artem focused on what they already had. The recording, second-hand but powerful, the photographs that proved surveillance and intent, the document stacks detailing corruption, and the story, a story that someone had once died to silence. Daniil absorbed the revelations with a frightening speed. It was as if for years he had been waiting for the truth to find him. He had lived so long with unanswered questions, with the dull ache of absence where a family should have been, that the sudden clarity of his origin sharpened him. The grief was there, but beneath it, a fury stirred. He and Artem spent hours going through the papers Artem had smuggled out. They pinned connections across Daniil's living room walls. Names, dates, signatures, maps. The web led to the same destination, repeatedly land deals, construction contracts, and one corporation positioned at the center like a carefully disguised spider. The corporation funding the highway. Artem had always known the project was too political, too rushed, too large to be clean. Now the proof sat scattered across a coffee table. At dusk, 2 nights later, Artem made a decision that settled like iron in his gut. They couldn't solve this alone. They needed someone with influence, someone willing to pick a fight with powerful enemies. Daniil searched his phone contacts and thought of one person, a former colleague of his mother, an investigative journalist named Yelena. She had vanished briefly after Daniil's parents disappeared, then re-emerged years later, quieter, more cautious, but still publishing stories that rattled cages. If anyone would dare help, it was her. They reached her through encrypted messages. Cautious at first, she agreed to a meeting in a crowded cafe at the heart of the city. Artem and Daniil arrived early, choosing a corner table where they could observe anyone entering. When Yelena stepped inside, she headed straight for them, her eyes sharp and searching. She looked older than her years' gray strands threaded through her hair, lines etched by stress rather than time. But when Daniil told her who he was and showed her the photograph, something inside her broke open. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, trying to contain both grief and outrage. "They were good people," she murmured, voice thick with memory. "They were brave, and they never deserved to be erased." Artem unfolded a few of the documents, revealing signatures tying high-ranking officials to the hush-hush land purchases around the swamp. Yelena's eyes widened. This is enough to reopen everything," she whispered. "But if we're going to do this, we do it publicly, all at once, before anyone can shut it down again." She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. "Give me images of everything. I'll make copies, send them to trusted contacts in other outlets. We go wide, national and international. We keep redundancy. No single point of failure." A plan formed, quick and desperate, but clear. Artem felt adrenaline rising into his throat as he handed over the first stack to be scanned. There was no turning back now. That night, Yelena published a breaking exposé, online details still vague, but heavy enough to trigger curiosity. She promised concrete revelations soon. Within hours, the story spread through social media and reached newsrooms far beyond their city. Pressure mounted. Officials scrambled to respond, stumbling over carefully rehearsed lines. The next morning, everything detonated. A second wave of reports hit headlines at dawn, this time with specifics. Scans of documents linking powerful businessmen and politicians to money laundering and contract fraud. Photos of Daniil's mother being followed by unmarked cars shortly before her disappearance. A blurred still frame from the forensic lab showing the sealed coffin. The audio snippet from the restored dictaphone chilling, raw played on national broadcasts. By noon, the city was in an uproar. Crowds marched outside government buildings. Protest signs rose like jagged teeth. Justice for the buried. Who killed the journalist? The swamp speaks. Police demanded answers from their superiors. Attorney offices received anonymous packages containing the same evidence, ensuring no single official could smother the truth. The Highway Corporation issued panicked public statements invoking cooperation and transparency, but their fear was visible beneath the polished language. Arrests began. 2 executives from the corporation taken into custody, a former deputy minister placed under investigation, a procurement manager seen escorted into a police car in handcuffs, his face drained of color. Artem watched the news from Daniil's apartment, hands shaking. He had not expected the reaction to be so swift, so explosive. The righteous anger of a public long starved for accountability erupted like a dam breaking. The swamp had not only given up the dead, it had given fire to the living. But triumph came with a bitter price. Later that evening, Daniil and Artem visited the cemetery where Daniil's mother lay buried. Her grave was modest, no photograph, no elaborate headstone, just her name, dates, and a memory too painful for anyone to handle properly back then. Daniil knelt, fingertips gliding over the carved letters. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I wish I could have known you longer. I wish you could see this." Artem stepped back, giving him space. The sun was setting behind the pines, framing Daniil in a halo of orange light. For a moment, it seemed like the world paused to honor a woman who had fought alone and lost. Daniil lifted his head, eyes blazing through tears. "My father deserves this too," he said. "He deserves to be buried beside her, together, not rotting in that swamp." Artem nodded. The image of the coffin resurfaced. Scratches, rust, terror frozen in metal. "We'll make sure of it," he said quietly. "He'll rest with her, and people will speak their names again." For the first time since this began, Daniil allowed himself a small, fragile smile. But the moment of peace was fleeting. Artem's gaze drifted across the cemetery grounds and stopped cold. A dark sedan parked far down the lane, engine silent, windows tinted black. Too familiar now to be mistaken. Watching, waiting. The message was unmistakable. Justice had been awakened. But vengeance, bruised and cornered, had not yet stopped breathing. The past was no longer buried, and the enemy had just begun to dig back. The cemetery wind carried a quiet chill, brushing across the gravestones like fingers searching for names once forgotten. Artem stood rigid, eyes fixed on the tinted sedan that lingered like a shadow refusing to obey the sun. He felt the weight of its stare even when he turned his back to it. The enemy was still there, cornered perhaps, but wounded predators did not retreat without teeth bared. As he and Daniil left the cemetery, neither needed to speak the fear tightening inside them. Daniil walked faster than usual, jaw clenched, fists balled. He had just begun to reclaim what had been stolen from him. The idea that someone still wished to rip it away again ignited a raw, shaking fury in him. In Artem, the fear twisted differently, protective rather than personal, heavy like wet concrete. He had brought this boy into the storm. Now he had to make sure the storm didn't swallow him. They parted ways carefully that evening, taking separate routes home and checking over their shoulders more than once. Light fell across the city in fading streaks, street lamps flickering awake as if reluctantly. Artem drove the long way, circling blocks before finally turning onto his street. When he parked and stepped out, he scanned the sidewalk, the balconies, the windows. Ordinary life pulsed around him, laughter drifting from a restaurant patio, a dog barking at a passing bus. Nothing seemed amiss, yet his instincts wouldn't rest. Inside his apartment, he opened blinds just a sliver, enough to watch without being seen. Hours slipped by. Midnight crept in. At last, exhaustion overpowered vigilance, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep on the couch. He woke to a pounding on his door. Not loud, controlled. Deliberate. His heart slammed against his ribs. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He rose slowly, feet silent on the floor. The knocking continued. Same pattern, 3 times. A pause, then 3 again. A rhythm meant to unsettle. He grabbed the first heavy object near him, a hammer, and approached the peephole with painstaking caution. Outside stood the foreman, shoulders hunched, his jacket soaked with rain. His face was a mixture of desperation and regret. Artem opened the door a crack. "I shouldn't be here," the foreman whispered immediately. "They told me to stay away from you, but I can't keep quiet anymore." His hands trembled as he stepped inside. "They're cleaning house," he said. Anyone who knows too much, anyone who might talk, they're making sure we stay silent. The malfunction, the fires, the threats, it's only the beginning. Artem felt the chill deepen. You're in danger? We all are, the foreman answered, voice breaking. They already came to my home. My wife, she begged me to quit. But quitting doesn't make you forget what you've seen. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper and internal memo from the corporation. It listed names of key figures from the exposed contracts, some underlined in red. Their own names were not there yet. But Daniil's name was, and beside it, an address. Artem's breath caught. We have to warn him. The foreman nodded, relief and fear warring in his eyes. I'll take a different way out, he said. If anyone asks, I was never here. As soon as he vanished down the hall, Artem grabbed his keys and rushed to his truck. Rain hammered the windshield like 1,000 urgent warnings as he sped toward Daniil's apartment, tires hissing across slick asphalt. Each stoplight felt like a trap, each passing car like a threat. He arrived to see lights on inside Daniil's apartment, but the front door stood wide open. Artem leapt from the truck and raced up the stairwell. He found Daniil standing in the middle of the room, soaked in emotion rather than water, anger, fear, and devastation all at once. The place had been torn apart, drawers yanked out, papers scattered, the walls stripped of the investigation map they had built together. They took everything, Daniil said hoarsely without turning. Everything but the truth inside my head. Artem placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. They're trying to scare you into silence. Daniil looked at him, eyes burning. Then they still haven't learned anything about me. I won't be erased. But strength, even righteous strength, was not immunity. Artem could see that Daniil's hands were trembling. News broke the next morning like thunder. The remains found in the swamp had been formally identified using DNA and cross-referenced with old dental records. The announcement hit every broadcast. The murdered man was indeed the engineer who vanished 15 years earlier. A wave of public outrage surged harder than before. Demands for legal action exploded on the steps of the courthouse. Under the pressure, the authorities authorized an emergency exhumation and reburial, this time with dignity. Daniil insisted on attending every meeting, signing every form required to claim his father's remains. He spoke to reporters with the quiet power of someone who had survived the worst the world could steal. When asked about the mother missing from his life, he answered with a trembling but steady voice, "She will be found in truth, if not in body." The news cycle shifted from speculation to accountability. More arrests followed. Investigations widened. Former allies turned on each other, scrambling to save themselves as damning evidence multiplied. Officials who once strode confidently behind podiums now kept their heads down, faces hidden behind folders when cameras tried to capture them. At last, a date was set for the reburial. It was cloudy that morning, the air holding its breath. Daniil stood beside the fresh grave, deep and open, waiting. Family friends who had once disappeared out of fear returned now, ashamed but grateful that the truth had survived against all odds. Yelena stood near them, documenting the moment with reverence rather than intrusion. Even the foreman appeared in the distance, hat in his hands, sorrow softening the lines of his tired face. Artem, like a silent guardian, never left Daniil's side. The coffin arrived, not the corroded tomb of the swamp, but a simple wooden one that bore no scars. Inside lay a man whose story had refused to be drowned, a man whose love for his wife and son had persisted beyond death. As the coffin was lowered beside his wife's grave, Artem felt something inside him shift, grief settling, justice breathing its first real breath. Daniil knelt and placed a photograph atop the coffin, the family picture Artem had found in the abandoned office. He touched the handwriting on the back softly with his thumb. He must live, and whispered, I did. And now you live again, too. When the final shovel of earth thudded into place, Daniil straightened slowly and looked upward. Clouds moved aside just enough for a single ray of sunlight to fall across the fresh earth, as though someone above had waited for this moment to offer blessing. The ceremony ended. People dispersed. But Artem lingered, standing at the edge of the grass and staring toward the distant city skyline. So much remained crooked in the world. So many truths buried not in swamps but in silence. The foreman approached quietly. "You should be proud," he said. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Artem shrugged, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I didn't do this for pride." "No," the foreman replied. "You did it because someone had to." After a moment, he clapped Artem gently on the shoulder and walked away. Alone now, Artem gazed down at the twin graves. Two people whose only crime had been refusing to let corruption go unchallenged. Two people who had paid for honesty with their lives. Yet the ground no longer held them in secrecy. It honored them. Artem exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The world felt calmer, but not safer. He knew real justice was messy, incomplete. Some conspirators would slip through cracks. New ones would rise to replace them. He brushed dirt from his palms and whispered into the still air, "If needed, I'll dig again." His words carried no bravado, only a promise. Behind him, Daniil waited by the gate. His eyes still red, but his expression steady. When Artem reached him, Daniil didn't speak. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of trust, of gratitude, of shared purpose. Together they stepped out of the cemetery and into a world that was still dark in many corners, but a little brighter now where it mattered most. The swamp had tried to swallow truth. But truth had surfaced, rusted and gasping, and it would not be buried ever again.